Hello and welcome. What future faces those affected by the huge oil spill off the US coast? Has an entire way of life been crippled for the foreseeable future? And that's become the focus now in the 8th week since the Deepwater Horizon offshore oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 and releasing millions of litres of oil into the ocean. The oil giant British Petroleum operated the rig and has been struggling badly to plug the leak. Just last week, the company began diverting some oil to a tanker, possibly 15,000 barrels per day, which is two-thirds of the leak by some estimations, although no one really knows how much oil is spilling into the Gulf Coast. Beyond the obvious environmental damage, loss of wildlife and destruction of the marsh habitat, there's growing concern over how this man-made disaster may destroy a way of life for the many Americans who depend on this habitat for their livelihood. Fishing has been banned in more than 30% of the Gulf, meaning oyster beds are closed and shrimpers have been shut down, and fishing tourism is at a standstill. BP is paying $5,000 a month to each business affected by this crisis, but that doesn't begin to cover the losses many are experiencing. If it's anything like the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill, the impact of this disaster could be felt for more than a decade. On today's show, we ask, does this oil spill mean the end of a way of life in the Gulf of Mexico? And if so, who should pay? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we'll take your phone calls on the show as well. Joining me now is Noah Hall, Executive Director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, where he works on precedent-setting litigation and policy development. A visiting professor at the University of Michigan Law School, Mr. Hall is also working on the next edition of the leading casebook in this field, Environmental Law and Policy, Nature, Law and Society. In New Orleans, I'm joined by Dr. Ricky Ott, a former commercial salmon fisherman, as she says, turned marine biologist and community activist. She's experienced firsthand the devastating effects of the Exxon Valdez oil spill and founded 3 non-profit organizations to deal with the lingering impact of that disaster. Dr. Ott's most recent work is Not One Drop: Promises, Betrayal and Courage in the Wake of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill. I welcome you both to the show, and Noah Hall, if I could start with you, sir. Is there any real clear indication at this stage what damage is being done? All these weeks have gone on. No one seems to have any clear information. Admiral Thad Allen, who's in charge of the cleanup, has given BP a 72-hour deadline for some real transparency. What do you expect to come out of that?
We don't have a lot of information at this point, and that's one of the frustrations for many of the residents along the Gulf Coast. They don't know the extent of the oil spill. They don't know how much oil is gushing out of the well every day and every minute. And nobody knows the full extent of the damages that this region is going to suffer. Really, the story just gets worse and worse every day, and as the weeks go on, we learn more about the extent of the damage. We learn about more people affected, more businesses that are being shut down. So the short answer is no, we don't yet know the full extent, and we probably won't know for some time.
But Noah, can you give me any kind of view on the way BP has handled what's been going on so far? It seems that it's been very tough to get information out of the oil company, and the way it's been dealing with the spill as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of frustration towards BP about how they've handled the spill, but it's very hard to figure out where that frustration should be properly placed and where it's just pointing fingers. We don't yet know what exactly BP has done or what they've done wrong in terms of responding to the spill. We know that there's a huge disaster. They're the responsible party. So far, I think they've done a pretty good job of accepting responsibility, writing checks, paying for things, and trying to stop the damage. But there's going to be a lot of finger pointing down the road about ultimately whose fault this was and whether BP did enough to respond. At the same time, I don't think the federal government should get a free pass either. The federal government is really where most Americans put the responsibility to ensure that our environment is adequately protected, right, and that companies like BP are regulated and overseen. And I think there's a lot of questions still to be answered about whether the federal government has done an adequate job as well.
We'll certainly have some questions about that coming up as well. I want to bring in Dr. Ricky Ott here, and thank you for being on the show, ma'am. And you've dealt with this before to some degree, in the sense that you've experienced firsthand what happened in 1989 with the Exxon Valdez spill. How do you compare the two? I know they're different kinds of spills, but you've dealt with the consequences. Is it really possible to measure the full extent of the damage that takes place with this kind of disaster?
Well, two things. One is that the response is playing out exactly the same as it played out in Alaska. BP is taking extraordinary steps to minimize its liability by restricting cameras, restricting them in the air, restricting the media on the beaches, restricting even the fishermen going out with cell phones. There have been a lot of reports from whistleblowers in the Coast Guard, from commercial fishermen coming in, reporting birds uncountable because they're all tangled up on the barrier islands. Dolphins dead as far as you can see. I mean, these reports are coming in. Also, we're hearing reports now of the dispersant spraying not only offshore but onshore, and this is what we tried to stop in Exxon Valdez. Dispersants are chemicals that need a huge volume of ocean to dilute the toxic effects, and what we have inshore is there's no ocean, right. So there's immediate problems.
Well, Dr. Ott, Noah Hall was saying how that the federal government shouldn't get off this lightly either. Based on what you've experienced, I mean, what do you think the government of the United States should be doing right now?
Allowing media access, allowing the agency that oversees worker safety to go out on to the spill response where the workers are actually working, measure the air quality, measure the exposure levels that the workers are being exposed to. Also, do this unencumbered from the other federal agencies. This is one federal agency is charged with worker safety, and it's not being allowed to do its job. It's getting misinformed. So it's not, for example, requiring respirators. We did this in Alaska. Hard hats, don't cut it. These people need respirators. And as far as measuring damage, NOAA, another federal agency, should be out there now. In Alaska, this federal agency was charged with monitoring ecosystem effects for 8 years after the Exxon Valdez.
Okay, well, let me get.
And we need this.
Sorry, ma'am. I'm going to get back onto some of these issues because you're raising a lot of interesting issues here. But I want to hear what Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, has been saying in a widely shown video. And BP has been very aggressive with its policy of trying to get its message out there. And this is part of what he had to say.
We will honour all legitimate claims, and our clean-up efforts will not come at any cost to taxpayers. To those affected and your families, I'm deeply sorry.
Tony Hall, all legitimate claims. I mean, BP has a lot of legal resources, but also has a lot of financial resources. To what extent is it going to meet its responsibility?
Well, legally, they're on the hook, and they're going to be paying the bill. And there hasn't been much dispute about that. And frankly, I think BP should be commended for stepping up to the plate, at least right now, and acknowledging that they're legally responsible and that they're morally responsible for this disaster. And I know that BP is taking a lot of criticism right now and is very unpopular in the Gulf region. But ironically, to some extent, we're fortunate that it's a company like BP with the financial resources to pay for the cleanup that's responsible here. If this were a small company, a fly-by-night operation, a mom-and-pop shop, they wouldn't have the financial resources to write the checks that are going to be needed to pay for the cleanup, the response, and all of the damages.
But of course, there's been the issue of the $75 million cap on any potential compensation.
Yeah, the $75 million cap, I'm glad you brought that up. It's really a non-issue. The $75 million cap, first of all, does not apply to the billions of dollars that BP is likely going to spend responding to and cleaning up this oil spill. Those costs are not subject to the cap. Further, the $75 million cap doesn't apply if BP is shown to have been negligent or violated any federal health and safety regulations, which is almost a certain likelihood. So I don't think the $75 million cap is going to be an issue here. And frankly, for all of the politicians who are running around and saying we need to do away with the $75 million cap, they're distracting the public from the real issue.
Dr. Ott, let me ask you about based on what you've seen in terms of how big business responds to these kind of issues, BP has, of course, a lot of financial resources to deal with the spill and to deal with potential compensation claims. What fear do you have, perhaps, that BP could deal with the sort of media hoo-ha right now, put out the money it needs to, but then down the road start to look at a much more coherent legal strategy to pull back?
When BP says we will pay for all legitimate claims, we heard that from Exxon 4 days after the spill. And what that is, it's a one-way ticket to the U.S. justice system, a court of law, a lawsuit. Because who decides what's legitimate and what isn't? And in Alaska, we ended up fighting Exxon for 20 years over legitimate claims, what was legitimate and what wasn't. And also, BP is probably going to write this off as a taxpayer, as a tax expense, cost of doing business. This is what Exxon did. There's no reason why BP wouldn't do it. So I think we're going to have this disappearing act and pull back.
And actually, Dr. Ott, in the case of the Exxon Valdez spill, the company was fined, was it $150 million, but the court forgave $125 million based on its cooperation with the proceedings. Now, of course, that leaves, if BP is cooperating very heavily now, it can argue the same thing, can't it?
It certainly can, and I think it's going to pursue exact same avenues that Exxon used. And in the end, we'll see who really pays are the environment and the people in the communities.
Now, Hall, an email came in from a viewer, if I may put this to you, sir. This is from Abdi Wahab Ali, who says, BP is responsible for failing to put measures to avert a crisis of this magnitude, while the US government is responsible for abandoning their oversight role. Now, you know, just it's a thought, years on down the road, you know, where do you think the real sort of finger of blame is going to be pointed? Because it comes down to also, as you mentioned, the issue of regulation of what the companies are able to do. Everyone seems to be in a scramble to get the oil out. But in terms of safety and regulations, what's missing?
Well, first of all, your viewer's email, I think, is spot on. There's a shared responsibility here between BP for not taking adequate precautions and the federal government for not adequately overseeing and regulating BP. But there's a much bigger underlying issue here. Americans want cheap energy and cheap gas. Politicians have known that for years. We want cheap prices at the gas pump. We don't want the cost of fuel to be a burden on our lifestyle or our prosperity. And so there's been tremendous political and economic pressure to drill as much oil as possible from any resources we have available, especially domestically. Where this is going to play out, it remains to be seen. I don't know if the United States is really going to make any fundamental changes in how we drill for oil, how we use oil, how we conserve oil, and how we regulate oil companies as a result of this spill.
Well, so I'm going to ask you both to stand by. We have to take a short break now. When we come back, what can be done to make sure this never happens again? Or is Noah Hall right in saying the global thirst for oil may be too much? More of our discussion when we come back.